In the last video, we spoke a little bit about how chapter 13 of Chronicles mirrors chiastically with chapter 21. These two chapters deal with David's failings in the spiritual or liturgical ritual realm. He doesn't follow the commandments that had been laid down in Mosaic law, and these lead to disasters. And that's what we're dealing with in this chapter, the first of these failings and the first of these disasters. The chapter is pretty short, so what we're going to do is I'm going to let the I'm going to let Logos read this chapter out for us. It's relatively short, so it shouldn't be too long, and then we'll come back and comment along as we've been doing.
Chapter 13. David consulted with the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, "If it seems good to you, and from the Lord our God, let us send abroad to our brothers who remain in all the lands of Israel, as well as to the priests and Levites in the cities that have pasture lands, that they may be gathered to us. Then let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul." All the assembly agreed to do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. So David assembled all Israel from the Nile of Egypt to Lebo-Hamath, to bring the ark of God from Kiriath-Jearim. And David and all Israel went up to Baalah, that is, to Kiriath-Jearim, that belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord, who sits enthroned above the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio were driving the cart. And David and all Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets. And when they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to take hold of the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he struck him down because he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of God that day, and he said, "How can I bring the ark of God home to me?" So David did not take the ark home into the city of David, but took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of God remained with the household of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months. And the Lord blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that he had.
Picking up on page 167 of John Stone's commentary, he says, the narrative now resumes at the point where it was broken off in 1 Chronicles 11:9. Jerusalem has been captured and the citadel built. David has taken up residence in the city of David and reigns with ever-growing power because the Lord of hosts was with him. This chapter emphasizes the sacramental character of the ark. To be in the presence of the ark is to be in the very presence of God himself, verses 8 and 10. Symbol and reality are one. To resort to the ark is indeed to resort to the sovereign of the universe. The chapter thus also expounds a significant consequence of this close identification between God and ark. As God's holiness is not to be infringed by those who would approach him, for example, Leviticus 10, verse 3, so too the ark must be treated as holy. I want to go ahead and take a look at Leviticus 10:3. And it says, Then Moses said to Aaron, This is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. In this episode, if you're not familiar, is the story with Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. And this is when they offer the strange fire, the unauthorized fire before the Lord, and they're consumed. They die in this particular episode. It's also worth noting, some commentators point out here in verse 9 that they also get this prohibition not to drink wine or strong drink. And so some speculate if maybe they were drunk when they did this. But either way, they are violating the rules that God has set before them, what they can and can't do, and that they are not honoring God's presence and by doing these things that he has prohibited them from doing. And I think to understand some of this, as well as the larger episode we're going to get in 1 Chronicles 13, we need to think a little bit about some of the logic behind idolatry, specifically in pagan type contexts. So the pagans, they were not idiots. They understood that their idols were not actually their gods. But they would go through these ceremonies and rituals, which you can read about in ancient texts. But at the end of these rituals, they would essentially animate these objects. They would go through the ceremony, and they believed then that their deity was localized in this object. That same logic is applied on a bigger scale to temples. This is really the problem with the Tower of Babel. It was a ziggurat, most commentators are going to argue. As such, it was essentially a temple site. It was a holy site. And this is why all the temples everywhere in every ancient religion essentially look the same. They were building artificial mountains because you pick that up everywhere. Every religion has this idea of the god or the gods dwelling on mountains because they're remote, far away, that kind of thing. So then it would almost be like building the deity something like a summer home that they're going to come and visit. It's a cosmic scale back scratching where they help you with your crops and fertility and things like that. And you offer them sacrifices, you give them worship. And so at Babel, they explicitly are disobeying God's commandment to be fruitful, multiply, and overspread, to spread out over the earth. Instead, they congregate, build a city and a tower, and are ultimately dispersed for that reason. That means what the people of Babel were trying to do was they were trying to control the relationship. They were trying to localize God to that location. And that's really what's behind a lot of the prohibitions, at least part of the logic behind the prohibitions against idols and things like that. It's attempting to control the relationship in a way that God has not sanctioned, or especially then did not sanction. Because when you move to the New Testament, things are a little bit different because now we boldly approach the throne and things like that. So things are different now, but this was all meant to serve as points of differences between God and the other gods. And this episode is one of these examples of the people treating God like one of the other gods by treating the sacred as something profane or something common. And just looking through the text, we're going to explore how that is the case, that is indeed what they're doing. And so as we read, the entire assembly of Israel was in agreement to do this thing. But it's actually not the entire assembly, as we'll note here as we look at what some of the commentators say. In Johnstone comments on page 168, kahal, which belongs to that cluster of words expressing gathering already noted in 1 Chronicles 11:1. Kahal also belongs to the traditional terminology applied to the Israel of the wilderness wandering period. And here he lists the times that happens. Elsewhere in the Pentateuch, it is used typically of Israel as rebellious. That's important. So here's a number of passages where that happens. Exodus 16:3, Numbers 14:5, 16:3, 22 through 12, as well as of its, that is Israel's constant need of sin offering and atonement. So in the only two contexts in Leviticus, 4:13 through 21 and 16 verses 17 and 33, that's the Day of Atonement. So the point here is the kahal language is used also in the Pentateuch for speaking of Israel as rebellious, as well as their need for sin offerings and atonements. In both of these aspects, the word is redolent of ideas that are central to Chronicles' purpose. Johnstone's point is that some of this kahal language is going to bring some pretty negative connotations in mind as well about Israel's rebelliousness and their need for atonement. Commenting on the language of sin abroad, the language is really important because it becomes something of a motif that's going to show up throughout this chapter and the next chapter in 14. Lightheart notes, the story of David's installation of the ark in Jerusalem can be told as a series of outbursts. The verb here is used 4 times in chapters 14 through 15, and the noun 5 times. Twice by itself and 3 times in place names. The story begins with an outburst from David. He says to the assembly of commanders and princes, "Let us burst out and sin." Johnstone suggests that the verb highlights the impetuous nature of David's plan. David does not assemble Levites. He does not consult the law of Moses. He just bursts out with a plan. And this is really important to note that even though it is saying kahal and the kind of all of Israel, the assembly, we learn, and I think Johnstone might note it in this particular note, that or maybe perhaps it's further down, but the Levites and the priests, they were actually still spread abroad. They were not actually there when it was happening, so they didn't actually consult. They didn't tell David, hey, this isn't the way we should do this, because they weren't even there. So he didn't wait for them. He just burst out. He just went for it. Johnstone notes, the Hebrew uses an unexpectedly violent verb in this context for the dynamic nature of the proposal of Israel. Literally, let us burst forth and send to our brothers. One may assume that the word has been deliberately chosen to express the hot-headed and unconsidered way in which David sets about an action that is perfectly laudable in itself. And he compares this to the proposal to build the temple, where it's, as he puts it, it's in principle acceptable, in practice unacceptable. So yes, they need to build the temple, but David's not the guy that's going to do it. Hahn, in his commentary on page 55, says, in invoking the ark, the chronicler again summons the historical memory of the Exodus and the entrance into the land. The ark becomes the gathering point of God's holy people. And it is striking and significant that, beginning with the convocation of Israel to embark on the mission of returning the ark, David said to all the assembly agreed, so on and so forth. The chronicler repeatedly refers to the assembly of all Israel as the kahal. This is the term for Israel's liturgical assembly that first appears in the biblical accounts of the Exodus and post-Sinaitic period. The first use of kahal in the canon is found on the night of the Exodus, in the divine instructions for how the whole assembly is to prepare for the journey. Combining what we read above, this means then that this language, the kahal language of the assembly, it brings to mind a couple of things. If you're familiar with the Bible, as obviously the ancient readers would have been, it brings to mind the Exodus. This is the first time they use the language, but again, it brings to mind these other moments of Israel's failings, again, also in the liturgical, Israel's liturgical assembly. That's the technical idea behind the kahal. And there are going to be times when they, as an entire group, have these failings. So it's not at all surprising that we would find this term beginning this story. And let's bring out this second panel here, because there's some language that connects chapter 13 and chapter 10. That's kind of interesting. So here on the let us bring, again, the ark of our God to us. Bring here is actually more literally transfer, something to that effect, because here it's the same language of turning the kingdom over to David. So it calls that back to mind. And we also have this language where David says, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul. And this language here, as we noted before, this seeking language is specifically what Saul failed to do. He failed to, it says here that he consulted, but literally sought a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. And so again, what David wants to do is actually a good thing. He just goes about doing it in the wrong way. And we also even, this one's pretty subtle, but it says, for this thing was right in the eyes of the people. Thing is actually literally the word. Or in this case, they translate it on this side as command. So again, Saul did not keep the commands of the Lord, or the words of the Lord. And here, the people of the assembly, they agree to move the ark for the command or the words of David in this case were right, which on one level they kind of were right, but on the other level they kind of were wrong in that, again, they didn't seek the proper guidance from God, and in this case specifically through God's mediators, the priests and the Levites. So let's move down to verses 5 and 6, and commenting on the place name here. Johnstone is actually going to note that it gives us both place names, or it gives us the old place name as well as kind of the updated one. And the Bible does this sometimes. But here, Johnstone thinks it's doing this because the inappropriate resonance of the name of the place with that of the rival deity Baal may be the reason for Chronicles to retain it. This was no place for the Ark of the Lord to be. In other words, he thinks they gave us that place name that contains the name of a rival deity so as to highlight the fact that there's that dissonance there. The Ark is in a city that goes by the name of another god. Moving further down, I just have a number of places where this language of sits enthroned above the cherubim is used. Now, to the actual episode proper. So they're moving it, they're carrying the ark on a new cart, and these men are driving the cart, they're celebrating, and then the oxen's going to stumble. So here, the Faith Life Study Bible points out here specifically, the problem is that they're carrying it inappropriately. If you were to read Exodus 25, 12 through 14, Numbers 4, 5 through 6, and verse 15, they had to carry it on these poles, and it was the Levites that were supposed to be carrying it, not animals. And Selman also notes here on this language that they put it on a new cart, that this same phrase is used in the Samuel episode, that we actually looked at it in I think the first week on chapter 10, when we talked a bit about the episode with the Philistines. So he points out the awareness of the divine majesty was diminished by the arks being separated from the tent, still at nearby Gibeon, and by its transportation on a new cart. The use of such an inadequate transport showed David unthinkingly continuing a Philistine superstition and failing to seek God. In other words, Israel got into difficulties because they failed to recognize that worship of the true God meant they could no longer simply follow contemporary pagan practices. Going down to verse 8, and David and all of Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets. Johnstone here notes that it's interesting because we have all this music and whatnot going on, but it's not until chapter 15 that the Levites are actually placed over the music as the leaders. So there's no indication here that the Levites were involved at all with this music. So once again, we have more of that theme of the people just breaking out and kind of doing whatever, improvising worship in a way that just was not sanctioned. Now in verse 9 here, we're going to get to the pivotal moment when they came to the threshing floor of Kidon. And Uzzah puts out his hand to take hold of the ark, for the oxen stumbles, and then he dies there before the Lord. So let's take a look at Scott Hahn, and he writes here, commenting on this moment where Uzzah reaches out and he takes hold of the ark. Hahn writes, "We are meant to notice the sharp contrast between the spontaneous gaiety and abandon of the people's first efforts to retrieve the ark, which anger God and result in Uzzah's death, and the meticulous preparations that precede the second attempt. Perhaps we are meant also to recall the divine warning before the theophany and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. There Moses was instructed to establish boundaries, lest the people touch the mountain and cause God to break out," the same language used, "against them, and they perish." The same odd verb, again, this breakout language, is used to describe Uzzah's fate and become a kind of watchword throughout the ark narrative. In fact, let's go back here, and we will bring out another biblical text, and let's make this text actually really small, and let's make both of them really small. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to click on one of these words about breaking out. Let me just find one. All right, so this is the first occurrence of the word. And as you can see here, broken out, Perez Uzzah. And here we get into chapter 14. Again, Be'el Perazim, bursting flood, broken through. So all of these highlighted portions in blue, it's the same language. We'll pick back up on that language when we get to chapter 14. But back to chapter 13 for now. I did want to note here that here in verse 9 that we do have this detail of the threshing floor. This is where, specifically, the place where this happens. And this is also going to link us to chapter 21. The end of that episode, the angel of the Lord is over the threshing floor, which is later going to be in Second Chronicles, identified specifically as the location of Isaac's near sacrifice in Genesis 22. But it's over a threshing floor again. So you have this divine breaking out, if you will, where the divine presence, it's a liminal realm, as some people would put it. It's a place where the divine meets the non-divine, the human. And threshing floors often serve in that kind of purpose. I actually have another video I did previously on threshing floor symbology, and I would encourage you to check that out because there's a lot of stuff going on with threshing floor places and language, things that happen on threshing floor sites. And I specifically argue there it's I think best understood as a place of testing and on some level also judgment as well. And so that he dies at the threshing floor. Specifically, this is the moment where the Lord he's finally had it with the people, that they've been carrying this for miles and doing this whole procession in an incorrect way, in a way that is not honoring God's presence. The fact that this happens at the threshing floor is very noteworthy. So we should store that away because, again, it's going to come back up in chapter 21 as well. And so after Uzzah dies, they call the place Perez Uzzah, again, the Lord breaking out against Uzzah. David kind of doesn't know what to do, and he takes the ark aside, and he takes it to Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and it's going to stay there for 3 months, and the Lord blesses Obed-Edom's house and all that he had. And this will move us into chapter 14, and it's going to break the narrative into wars with the Philistines until chapter 15, where they do successfully move the ark. But I do want to note here that this man, Obed-Edom, is actually an interesting figure. John Stone comments, Chronicles retains the striking note that Obed-Edom was a Gittite, that is, from the Philistine town of Gath. But more significantly, in the sequel, that chapter 21, or I'm sorry, not chapter 15, Chronicles identifies Obed-Edom as a Levite with responsibilities as gatekeeper to the ark, a lute player among the temple musicians, son indeed of Jeduthun, and keeper of the temple storehouses. Obed-Edom is not a conveniently expendable alien, but a Levite, one of the approved personnel. And similarly, piggybacking off of this observation, Lightheart notes that it's possible that his family was among the exiles who joined David in Ziklag, a city under the hegemony of Gath. Obed-Edom's name, servant of Edom, suggests otherwise, and there is another explanation. He was ethnically Philistine, and that's more or less what John Stone was getting at, a Gentile who was adopted into the Levitical clan after successfully caring for the ark. Just as Joshua conquered the land with a mixed multitude of Israelites and Gentiles, so David reconquers the land and raises up the Lord's throne only with the assistance of Gentiles. Israel was never supposed to be isolated from Gentiles. Incorporating Gentiles was essential to the success of Israel's mission. In fact, right after this little mini episode with Obed-Edom, we go into chapter 14, and it immediately begins speaking of Hiram, the king of Tyre, and he's going to send him building equipment, for the temple, that kind of thing. So it's very much in line with that motif. One thing that is worth noting, we have Obed, right? The beginning of his name, the prefix, and which means something like servant or worshiper or something like that. Like the name Obadiah means servant or worshiper of Yahweh. But it should be noted the other part of his name, Edom, is actually a deity name. It's a pagan deity. And so some commentators do wonder about that, as far as either it's possible that that's just part of his name. He was just given that name. It's also possible that there's something of a title in that. So perhaps he was not just a pagan Gentile, but perhaps he was actually a pagan Gentile priest. But he's converted into Yahweh worship in this episode here. So not really entirely sure everything about him, But he is an interesting figure, and I think he does fit with this motif of the Gentiles being brought in, which of course is just a small shadow of the reality of the New Testament, of the complete ingrafting of the Gentiles. But he could be one of these figures in the Old Testament, one of these Gentile figures that becomes very deeply associated with the people of God, and in this case specifically with worship in the liturgical realm. But that is chapter 13, and we will look at chapter 14 next time.